The question today is the Chinese economy close to experiencing a huge economic and financial crisis? Could the so-called Chinese model collapse? VisualPolitik community, as recently as 2020, the Chinese government was promising widespread contentment. The country had faced the trade war unleashed by Donald Trump and was one of the first countries to contain the SARS coronavirus 2 pandemic. Even despite being the source of the pandemic, the Chinese economy had one of the best performances in the world. Since then, however, things have changed almost completely. Take a look.
22nd of July 2022. China growth slows sharply, putting GDP target out of reach.
During the second quarter of 2022, the Chinese economy barely grew by 0.4%. With the exception of the coronavirus era, it was the worst figure in the last 30 years and put the 5.5% growth target that Xi Jinping's government had set for the whole year in danger. Forget everything you remember about China's successes, because now the scenario is completely different. Since the second half of 2021, a kind of economic whirlwind has been brewing within the Asian giant. Youth unemployment is on the verge of surpassing the 20% mark. Retail activity has slowed to the point that in real terms, retail sales are negative. Housing prices have been falling since the summer of 2021. And to top it all off, as you can see on the screen, capital flight from the country has skyrocketed, eating into much of the country's enormous trade surplus.
China is in trouble. That's due to the strong dollar and foreign investors looking at China in a new light after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Robin Brooks, chief economist at the Institute of International Finance.
Even the growth of what has been one of the crown jewels of the Chinese economy has become volatile. Check it out. In fact, giants such as Alibaba, Tencent, and Didi, among many others, are carrying out huge number of layoffs, partly because of the bad economic period, and partly because of the pressure exerted by Beijing on these companies has damaged their profitability.
China's big tech firms are axing thousands of jobs.
The fact that this scenario has forced the government to ask large public companies and the state apparatus itself to hire more young people so that things do not get out of control. But that seems like a feast today and a famine tomorrow situation. Perhaps the only good news for the Chinese economy during the first half of 2022 was that, despite everything, foreign direct investment increased strongly. But as you could see, there is much more negative data than positive data. So the question is, just how bad is the economy faring? Why do things look so concerning? How close are we to a possible collapse? What does Xi Jinping intend to do to prevent China from suffering its first major crisis in more than 50 years? Well, let's get into it.
How far do the problems extend?
Going against the grain of the rest of the world, in mid-August 2022, the People's Bank of China decided to cut interest rates.
15th of August 2022. China shocks with rate cut as data shows alarming slowdown.
Not only that, but at the same time, the government announced an increase in public spending. Wait a minute, lower rates and more government spending? This means that the Chinese government is behaving as if the country were already in crisis, or even recession, which is also what the data we are coming to recognize are telling us. It is not easy to know precisely what is going on in China. We are not exactly talking about the most transparent country in the world. However, the situation seems even worse than what the government's estimated GDP growth reflects. But of course, we are talking about China, a country that officially has not experienced negative growth, neither after the Tiananmen Square massacre, nor in the Asian financial crisis of 1997, nor in 2007. So the fact that China has published practically its worst growth figure in the last 30 years tells us a lot about how things are going. Not exactly swimmingly, but how far do China's problems really go? What are the biggest holes in the Chinese economy today? Well, pay close attention, because these are the 5 major problems today that complicate the economic future of this country and the possible response of the government to try to reverse the bad data we have seen. The first of these has a lot to do with the very basic workings of the Chinese economy. You see, while in most parts of the world, GDP is a measure of what has been produced in a country over a period of time, in the case of China, it's somewhat different. Yes, GDP measures exactly the same thing, but the difference is that it is a politically determined indicator set in advance. That is, the government sets a growth target and then pushes all public and private players to try to achieve it. This is the direct effect of planning. And you may wonder, so where is the problem? Basically, when officials believe that this growth is not going to be achieved, they pull out all kinds of tricks and measures to try to achieve it. For example, they throw themselves like crazy into building infrastructure and all kinds of large projects. They make public companies start hiring as if there were no tomorrow, and they expand credit without breaks. So that, for example, families buy more and more houses, and this boosts growth. Everything in order to achieve the annual goal. To top it off, the vast majority of the banking sector in China is public. That is, it works to meet the government's objectives, and if more growth is needed, they go crazy granting new credit. Even if that credit is given to people or companies with doubtful payment capacity, it doesn't matter. They have to meet the credit granting targets set by the state, so that these in turn help to achieve the growth targets. Do you see where the problem lies? In any case, for years, this was not strictly a problem because China was underinvested. It had little infrastructure, few companies, and a housing shortage. So everything that was done was tremendously productive. However, since about 10 to 15 years ago, the situation has changed completely. China has built so much that new infrastructure, for example, or the expansion of state-owned enterprises' capacity is no longer profitable. In other words, they do not generate sufficient returns to compensate for all the investment made. The result? A huge debt spiral. Take a look. Debt in China has grown so much that between the years 2007 and 2017 alone, it increased fourfold, an increase greater than that of any other country. In fact, today, in terms of GDP, the Chinese have more debt circulating than the United States itself. And you know what? This brings us directly to the second problem. While debt has grown a lot, productivity, which in the end is what largely determines the ability to pay those debts, has plummeted. This means that China has to invest many resources to maintain growth. Investment that is financed with debt and yet generates little return. And VisualPolitik community, what happens when your debt skyrockets? Your ability to pay is reduced, and on top of that, your economy goes into crisis and you lose income? Well, you have a problem. And above all, your banks have a serious problem. Why? Because many of your loans may go into default. That is, the debtors may not be able to pay them. This is the third major risk, the third major problem facing the Chinese economy, the possibility of a huge financial crisis. However, we will cover this matter very soon and with all the details in an upcoming video, so stay tuned. And if you don't follow VisualPolitik yet, then don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you keep up to date with all of our news. Well then, in addition, there is a fourth major issue that is closely related to the third one and to everything we have already mentioned. The implosion, the bursting of the real estate market. This is a market that is simply gigantic. To give you an idea, in 2021 alone, $2.4 trillion of new housing was sold in China. That's trillions with a T. Directly and indirectly, this sector accounts for almost 30% of the entire Chinese economy. So it's really no joke. We are talking about one of the main economic drivers of the Asian giant. Well, since the summer of 2021, things in this sector have been going from bad to worse, and investment and housing sales and prices are plummeting.
15th of August 2020. Ticking time bomb. China's real estate bust deepens as housing prices fall for the 11th straight month.
And that's not all. Capital Economics, a London-based consultancy firm, notes that by the end of 2021, in China, there were approximately 30 million unsold properties and about 100 million more that were sold but unoccupied. And obviously, assuming such a large part of the Chinese economy, the bursting of the real estate sector, is something that could be potentially very serious for the Chinese economy. The collapse of this industry could lead to hundreds of thousands, millions of unemployed, the collapse of many property developers, many more problems for the banks, and a general impoverishment of the Chinese due to the loss of value of their properties. Remember that houses form the largest part of the wealth of families in this country, and if house prices fall, then suddenly these families with huge mortgages behind them become instantly much poorer. The situation is so delicate that videos like this one have gone viral on Chinese networks. Check it out.
我希望在今天的会议上，我们各位同志们和领导要带头攻防，来了一套，买两套，来了两套，买三套，来了三套，买四套。下面我宣布，市民县2022年。
Of course, there doesn't seem to be any room for that to happen, and it doesn't seem advisable. But moving on, the fifth problem lying ahead for China has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine. You see, the trade war initiated by Donald Trump and Beijing's growing belligerence set off alarm bells for many companies. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Chinese government's COVID-0 policy have once again put the geopolitical risk and the importance of securing supply chains back on the table. This may cause many multinationals to relocate part of their operations, or at least concentrate their new investment outside China over the next few years. This has not yet happened, but companies are known to be concerned. So if foreign companies' investment in this country is ultimately curbed, this could be a serious blow to China's economic growth. In other words, it could seriously hamper recovery. To make matters worse, in the immediate term, the international energy crisis could end up causing a drop in Chinese exports that could further aggravate the economic problems this giant already faces. And then finally, although it is not something that is going to have consequences in the immediate future, but in the medium and long term, we do have to take into account the demographic issue. China is aging at full speed. In fact, it is very likely that the working age population is already shrinking, which is exactly what will continue to happen to the country's population over the next few years. In the same vein, in 2021, the birth rate in China fell to an all-time low. Obviously, a smaller and older population will translate into more public spending, less economic dynamism, and higher debt per capita. Well, the fact is that these 5 major problems, or 6 if we include the demographic decline, could be a serious headwind for China's economic flight. If not well managed, they may even end up causing a serious economic and financial crisis in China. So the question is the so-called Chinese model in danger of collapsing? And perhaps the most important question right now, what on earth does Xi Jinping's government intend to do to reverse this situation? Well, let's take a look.
The Great Failure of Xi Jinping.
Okay, I know what many of you are thinking. Let's see, Josh. All countries experience economic, monetary, and financial crises at one time or another. From the United States to the European Union to Japan to South Korea. And let's not get started on Latin America. So, isn't it a bit of an exaggeration to talk about the possible collapse of the Chinese model because a few economic indicators are not going well? Well, yes. And at the same time, no. For decades, the Chinese model has consisted of guaranteeing a rapid improvement in living standards in exchange for the Chinese not questioning the government and the power of the Communist Party. Let's say it has been something like a kind of tacit, unwritten agreement that has legitimized Chinese governments. And it was this way during the terms of Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. To achieve this, the opening up and integration of China into the global economy was essential. However, things have changed and are still changing under Xi Jinping. Since the current leader took the helm in 2012, the government began to intervene more in the economy. Growth has slowed, and also, in an attempt to maintain higher growth rates, corporate, household, and public sector debt has multiplied. In this way, the figures have gradually deteriorated, and while yes, China has many strengths, the truth is that the explosive prosperity that has characterized this country for years has disappeared. Xi Jinping cares much more about the social, political, and economic control of the Communist Party than the level of prosperity. So, let's say that with him, China is slowing down its opening up. It is even becoming, once again, more totalitarian, with all the consequences that entails. But be that as it may, the question now is, what on earth does the Chinese government intends to do to avoid the crisis? Well, probably the same old formulas. The problem is that this time, they may not be enough. On the one hand, to avoid crises, the Chinese government has always resorted to fiscal stimulus, and above all, monetary stimulus. That is, expanding public spending and greatly increasing the granting of credit. Do you remember that China lowered interest rates? Well, exactly that. They have also approved large lines of credit for businesses, and are lowering the requirements for buying homes. In the past, this has worked. However, it was done at the cost of increasing outstanding debt by a lot. And now the debt seems too large for these policies to have much traction. In fact, over the last few months, the money supply has grown much faster than the stock of credit. What's more, lowering rates when the Federal Reserve is doing exactly the opposite could increase capital outflows from the country. Then, on the other hand, President Xi Jinping has called for an effort by all public players to increase spending on infrastructure so that it can become a kind of economic cushion against the slowdown in the real estate sector.
14th of July 2022. China readies $1.1 trillion to support Xi's infrastructure push.
Wait a minute though, because it's not that simple. Why? Because one of the main sources of financing for the local and regional governments is the sale of land and revenues from the real estate sector. And guess what? Land sales have dropped 30% in 12 months. This is what explains why these governments have started 2022 issuing debt at a record pace to finance all kinds of infrastructure, such as industrial parks, transportation networks, water projects, mobile networks, and data centers. Which brings us directly back to the problem we saw earlier. Xi Jinping is trying to maintain China's economic growth by issuing debt and building infrastructure that is not profitable, because most of it is not needed. And since it is not profitable, once the projects are finished, they no longer contribute to economic growth, but the debt and the interest remain. In short, China may still have many strengths and many sectors that are going from strength to strength. However, its overall situation has been deteriorating sharply over the past few years. Now the country seems on the verge of facing an economic and perhaps financial crisis, and it is not at all clear how the government expects to deal with it, because, as you've seen, the usual formulas may not work this time. Could this mean that the era of great Chinese growth has come to an end? Well, more and more analysts are pointing to this possibility. All in all, perhaps the biggest problem is that Xi Jinping wants to compensate for the worsening economic performance with a much more aggressive nationalism. And that would be bad for everyone. But having reached this point, it's your turn. Do you think China will end up plunging into a severe economic crisis? Or on the contrary, do you think it will manage to overcome all of its problems? Do you think the so-called Chinese model could collapse? What will Xi Jinping do to face all of these problems? As always, leave us your comments below and give us a like if you found this video interesting. Thank you so very much for watching. All the best, and I'll see you next time.